My name is Morgan. I'm in my mid 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been someone people describe as steady, dependable, quiet in a way that makes others comfortable. I work a normal job, live in a normal city, and if you passed me on the street, you probably wouldn't remember my face 5 minutes later. I've learned that this kind of invisibility can feel safe to others. It makes them assume you'll always be there, always listening, always waiting. That's not a complaint, it's just an observation. People often underestimate me because I don't raise my voice, don't dramatize my feelings, and don't rush to correct misunderstandings. I've been called low maintenance, which usually means my needs are easy to forget. I've been told I'm strong, but usually only after I've absorbed something quietly and moved on without asking for acknowledgement. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing someone or winning an argument years too late. It's about a moment that looks small from the outside and irreversible from the inside. A single decision made in seconds, shaped by years of silence, distance, and assumption. I deleted my father's voicemail without listening. It was his last call. And the sentence that keeps echoing underneath everything is this: I assumed there would always be time, until there wasn't. I want to be clear about what this story is and what it isn't. There are no villains here in the traditional sense, no shouting matches, no last minute reconciliations wrapped in music. What unfolds is quieter than that, more uncomfortable. It's about how emotional patterns get normalized, how absence can feel ordinary, and how a single overlooked notification can carry the weight of an entire relationship. This is a first person account, told as honestly as I can tell it now, with the benefit of hindsight, but without rewriting my own motivations to look better. I won't ask for sympathy, and I won't offer excuses. I'm not proud of every part of this story, but I'm also not ashamed of telling it. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through who I was in my family, how certain roles are assigned without discussion, and how silence, real silence, not the dramatic kind, can become both a shield and a weapon. You'll hear about the small moments people dismiss, the ones that don't seem important until they start to stack. And eventually, you'll understand how deleting a voicemail felt less like an action and more like the final step in something that had been forming for years. If you've ever assumed there would be another call, another apology, another chance to deal with something later, I think you'll understand why this story still matters to me. Before we go any further, let me ask you something gently, without judgment. Have you ever postponed listening to someone because facing it felt heavier than avoiding it, just for a little while? In my family, I was the easy one. That's the role I was given early, and I carried it so well that no one ever thought to ask whether I wanted to keep it. I didn't rebel. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't make scenes. When something went unsaid, I learned to live around it. When plans changed, I adjusted. When silence settled in, I treated it like weather, uncomfortable sometimes, but not personal. To them, I was independent, self sufficient. Morgan doesn't need much, my father used to say, usually in a tone that sounded like praise. And for a long time, I believed it was. My father was not cruel. That's important to say. He wasn't explosive or abusive or openly dismissive. He was simply elsewhere, busy, preoccupied, confident that love didn't need maintenance if it had been established once. He believed showing up occasionally was enough, especially once I stopped asking for more. I learned quickly that needing less made things smoother, so I did. In family conversations, I listened more than I spoke. When decisions were made, they were often already decided by the time I heard about them. Not maliciously, just efficiently. I was looped in after, not because I didn't matter, but because I wouldn't object. And I didn't. If someone forgot to call me back, I assumed they were busy. If weeks passed without hearing from my father, I told myself that adulthood was like that. Everyone was tired. Everyone had responsibilities. Love didn't always announce itself. Over time, people stopped checking whether I was okay with the gaps. They stopped explaining. They stopped worrying. I became the emotional background noise of the family. Constant, unobtrusive, easy to ignore without realizing you were doing it. My father would leave messages sometimes, short ones, updates about practical things, a holiday reminder, a comment about the weather back home. Rarely questions, almost never pauses long enough to invite a response. I'd listen later. I always listened later. That was the unspoken agreement. He would reach out when it occurred to him, and I would receive it quietly, gratefully, without complication. From the outside, it looked healthy. We weren't fighting, we weren't estranged, we just weren't close in a way that required effort. And I didn't challenge that because challenging it felt like asking for something I wasn't sure he could give. In my professional life, this same trait was rewarded. I handled problems without escalating them. I noticed inefficiencies others missed. I carried responsibility without advertising it. People trusted me because I didn't demand attention. But in my personal life, that same quiet competence translated into invisibility. No one worried about losing me because I never threatened to leave. No one rushed to say the hard things because I wasn't forcing the conversation, including him. If you asked my father who I was to him, he would have said, Morgan's doing fine. She's always been strong. And I think he believed that absolved him from checking more closely. I believed it too. For a long time, being underestimated felt like peace. It meant fewer expectations, fewer disappointments. It meant I could move through relationships without friction. I didn't realize that the cost of that peace was unseen. And when you're unseen long enough, people start to assume you'll always be there, quietly waiting, patiently available, indefinitely reachable. That assumption sat beneath everything that came later. At the time, I didn't recognize it as a fracture. It felt like normal life, like adulthood, like distance that didn't mean anything. But this is how the story really begins. Not with a voicemail, not with loss, but with a role that made my absence impossible to imagine. The first moment that stayed with me didn't feel important at the time. That's how these things usually start. Not with something sharp, but with something almost forgettable. It was a missed call, one of many. I had called my father on a Sunday afternoon, standing in the narrow kitchen of my apartment, watching water boil for pasta. I remember the light coming through the window because it was unusually soft for Portland. I remember thinking, if he answers, I'll just keep it light. He didn't. I left a short message. Nothing emotional, just an update. Work was busy. I might visit later in the year. I hoped he was doing well. I hung up without waiting for the beep to finish, as if ending it quickly would make it less like a request. He didn't call back that day. or the next. A week later, when we finally spoke, it was because he needed a document I had access to, something logistical related to family paperwork. He moved straight into the request, confident I would help, already halfway through the explanation before saying hello. I helped. Of course I did. Near the end of the call, I mentioned casually that I tried to reach him the previous weekend. I kept my tone neutral, almost apologetic, like I was pointing out a scheduling error, not an emotional one. Oh, he said, I must have missed it. That was it. No follow up question. No curiosity about what I wanted to talk about. No pause long enough to suggest we might circle back. We moved on. I remember standing very still after the call ended, phone still in my hand, realizing something had shifted, but not knowing how to name it. There was no argument to replay, no harsh words to analyze. Just a quiet recognition that my reaching out didn't register the same way his needs did. Everyone else would have dismissed it. I did too, at first. People miss calls. Life happens. It wasn't personal. But my body reacted before my mind did. I stopped initiating contact as often after that. Not consciously, just naturally. As if some internal system had recalibrated to conserve energy. The next time he called, weeks later, it was again about something practical. He thanked me for handling it, told me I was reliable, a word he used often, always with approval. I didn't mention the missed calls again. That's the thing about being the calm one. You learn early that bringing things up creates discomfort, and discomfort feels like failure. So you absorb it instead. You tell yourself it's minor. You smooth it over internally. But small cuts don't bleed loudly, they just stay open. What made this moment different wasn't what he did, it was how easily everyone accepted it as normal. My siblings joked about how dad's terrible at phones. Friends shrugged when I mentioned it. At least he called sometimes, one of them said. And they were right. Compared to real neglect, this seemed insignificant. So I filed it away. Not as a grievance, just as data. I started noticing patterns after that. Who followed up? Who didn't? Who asked questions? And who made statements? Who assumed access to me and who treated my time like something optional? My father didn't notice the change because it didn't inconvenience him. I was still available when needed, still agreeable, still emotionally low friction. That's what made it possible for the pattern to continue. The first small cut didn't hurt because it was dramatic. It hurt because it clarified something I hadn't wanted to see. My presence was appreciated, but not prioritized. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You just learn how to live with it, quietly. After that first moment, nothing changed on the surface. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in slowly, disguised as routine. My father and I continued the way we always had. Periodic calls, short messages, practical conversations that began and ended efficiently. If there was an emotional undercurrent, it stayed unacknowledged, like a draft in a closed room you stopped trying to fix. I told myself this was adulthood. That closeness evolved, that not everyone needed constant emotional check ins to feel connected. I repeated these explanations so often, they started to sound like facts. When he forgot to call back, I adjusted my expectations. When he didn't ask about my life in detail, I summarized it faster. When conversations drifted toward his needs, I followed without resistance. I became skilled at pre editing myself. I noticed I stopped sharing things that didn't have a clear purpose. Promotions, setbacks. I didn't have answers to some questions yet. If there was no direct utility in the information, it stayed with me. Not because I didn't want him to know, but because I'd learned there was no space for it. And because I didn't push, there was never a moment that required him to reflect. That's the subtle cruelty of being low maintenance. People don't mistreat you intentionally. They just never practice caring for you in ways that require effort. There were holidays when we spoke briefly, ticking the obligation box. Birthdays are marked by short texts sent at convenient times. Conversations that ended with, "We'll catch up soon," a phrase that meant nothing and everything at once. I remember once mentioning, very softly, that I missed him. I framed it as nostalgia, a casual comment about how things felt different now that I lived farther away. He laughed gently and said, "You've always been independent. You were never the clingy one." It wasn't meant to hurt. That made it worse. Because in that moment, I realized that the version of me he held on to was the one that required the least from him. And every time I played that role well, it reinforced the idea that this distance was mutual, even chosen. So I stopped challenging it. I didn't call out the dismissals. I didn't name the imbalance. I told myself that expecting more would be unfair, that this was just who he was, that love didn't always look the way you wanted it to. And maybe that's true, but what I didn't admit, what I couldn't admit yet, was that I was shrinking myself to fit the relationship and calling it maturity. The disrespect wasn't loud enough to protest. It arrived as an omission, as forgetting, as conversations that ended before they reached me. And because nothing exploded, I convinced myself nothing was wrong. This pattern extended beyond my father. Family members came to me when things needed fixing, organizing, smoothing over, rarely to ask how I was doing in ways that required time. I became the person you lean on, not the one you lean into. And every time I accepted that role without comment, it became harder to imagine stepping out of it. I didn't see myself as someone being wronged. I saw myself as someone being understanding. That's how disrespect survives. It disguises itself as reasonableness. By the time I noticed how one sided things had become, I'd already participated in maintaining it for years. And admitting that felt like admitting I'd been complicit in my own erasure. So I normalized it instead. I told myself, this is enough. This is fine. This is just how it is. And for a while, I believed it. Roles don't usually come with announcements. No one sits you down and explains what's expected. They form quietly, shaped by repetition and reward. And once you perform them well enough, people stop imagining you any other way. In my family, my role was clear long before I ever named it. I was the one who would be fine, not the one who needed reassurance, not the one whose silence meant something was wrong. My silence meant everything was under control. If I didn't call, it meant I was busy. If I didn't respond quickly, it meant I was handling something. No one worried. No one followed up. That wasn't neglect. It was trust, they would have said. And maybe it was. But trust without attention can start to feel indistinguishable from indifference. When something needed to be done, documents organized, schedules coordinated, difficult conversations softened, I was the quiet solution. The person who wouldn't escalate, wouldn't complain, wouldn't make things harder than they already were. Reliable, useful, invisible. The role was so comfortable for everyone else because it required nothing new from them. I didn't force growth. I didn't disrupt the emotional economy of the family. I absorbed what others didn't want to hold. My father leaned into this more than anyone, though I don't think he realized it. He spoke to me like someone who would understand without explanation. He assumed I'd agree before he asked. He filled the silence with logistics, not curiosity, and I allowed it because pushing back felt like introducing chaos into a system that relied on my calm. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being the strong one. People assume you don't need witnessing, that you don't need to be asked how you are beyond surface answers. They take your composure as proof that nothing is missing. I started to notice how often my feelings were inferred instead of asked about. You're probably fine with that, right? You don't mind, do you? You're easy, you'll understand. Each sentence closed a door gently, politely, before I had a chance to step through. And I kept nodding because disagreeing would require explaining myself. And explaining myself would require admitting there was something to explain. In quiet moments, I wondered what would happen if I stopped performing the role, if I let my absence be noticeable, if I allowed my silence to feel like silence instead of stability. But those thoughts felt selfish, dramatic, unnecessary. So I stayed where I was useful. The irony is that by being so consistent, I trained everyone, including my father, to believe I would always be there in the same way, with the same availability, the same patience, the same emotional accessibility. I became permanent in their minds, and permanent things don't get checked on. I don't blame them entirely. Roles persist because they work. They simplify relationships. They prevent conflict. They allow people to move through life without questioning their own behavior too closely. But roles also flatten you. By the time I recognized how confined mine had become, I no longer knew how to step out of it without causing disruption. And disruption felt like a betrayal of the very identity that had kept things peaceful. So I stayed quiet. And that quiet, the kind that looks like strength from the outside, was slowly becoming something else entirely. The day something shifted didn't arrive with an argument or a revelation. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no dramatic line drawn in the sand. If you'd looked at my life from the outside, you would have seen an ordinary weekday, unfolding exactly as expected. That's what made it dangerous. I was sitting at my desk at work, scrolling through emails with the kind of detached efficiency you develop when you've done the same job long enough to predict most outcomes. My phone buzzed. A missed call. My father's name. I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. There was no rush of anxiety, no spike of anticipation, just a dull awareness that I could call back later, that I always did, that there would be time. I put the phone face down and finished what I was doing. An hour passed, then two meetings, a late lunch. By the time I checked my phone again, there was a voicemail notification waiting. I didn't listen to it, not because I was angry, not because I was avoiding him. I simply registered it as something I would get to, something that didn't require immediate attention because it never been before. And that's when I realized something quietly, almost clinically. My father's voice no longer carried urgency in my body. It wasn't a decision I made consciously. It was a conditioning that had happened over the years. Missed calls that meant nothing, messages that contained no questions, conversations that ended without depth. My nervous system had learned that responding later was safe. That recognition unsettled me more than any argument could have, because it meant the distance between us wasn't accidental anymore. It was operational. That afternoon, a co-worker asked if everything was okay. I said yes without thinking. The word came out automatically, smooth and unexamined. I drove home in silence, radio off, noticing how familiar this emotional flatness felt. Not heavy, not sharp, just muted. At home, I set my bag down, fed the cat, and changed clothes. Normal rituals. I saw the voicemail notification again and felt a brief, faint resistance, like standing outside a door you don't feel ready to open. I'll listen after dinner, I told myself. But even as I thought it, I knew something had shifted. Because the thought wasn't about timing, it was about emotional readiness, about whether I wanted to engage with whatever tone, whatever need, whatever distance his voice might carry. And I realized I didn't trust it to give me anything back. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not visible, but definitive. I sat on the edge of my bed and asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. What if I didn't always make myself available? The idea didn't feel rebellious. It felt logical. I wasn't withdrawing out of spite. I was conserving something: energy, attention. The part of me that had learned to stay open without receiving much in return. I didn't call him back that night. I slept well, which surprised me. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that felt almost unsettling, like standing in a room where the furniture had been rearranged while you were asleep. Everything was familiar, but your body moved differently. I understood then that silence could be more than endurance. It could be a choice. And once silence becomes a choice, it stops being passive. That was the day the pattern stopped being invisible to me. The day I saw my role clearly enough to consider stepping out of it. Not with confrontation, but with restraint. I still hadn't listened to the voicemail. At the time, it felt like a small postponement. I didn't know yet that it was the beginning of something irreversible. After that day, nothing outwardly changed. That was the strange part. There was no fallout, no concerned follow up, no sudden escalation. The world continued to treat my silence the same way it always had, as something neutral, even reassuring. But internally, everything was different. For the first time, I was aware of my silence as an action rather than a default. I noticed when I chose not to respond immediately. I noticed the absence of urgency in my body, and I noticed how rarely that absence was challenged. My father didn't call again that week. No message asking if I'd gotten his voicemail. No gentle check in. No adjustment to the pattern. The system corrected itself by assuming I would return when I was ready. And I didn't. Instead, I observed. I paid attention to how often people in my life reached out without waiting for a response before moving on. How rarely my availability was confirmed rather than assumed. How silence from me created no disruption because it had never been allowed to mean anything. That realization was both sobering and empowering. Silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes information. It reveals who notices, who follows up, who feels the gap, and who doesn't. I wasn't testing anyone. I wasn't playing a game. I was simply stepping back from the reflex to accommodate. My father's next call came days later. I watched it ring, not with resentment, with curiosity. I wondered if he would leave a message that acknowledged the space, that asked a question, that sounded different. He didn't. The voicemail was short, practical, a continuation of the same rhythm we'd always had. He assumed I'd hear it when I had time. He assumed access without confirmation. I didn't delete it. I just let it sit. What surprised me most was how quickly others misinterpreted my silence. At work, a delayed response was seen as confidence, authority. At home, family members assumed I was busy, productive, thriving. Silence protected my image while allowing me to withdraw emotionally. No one accused me of pulling away because I had never been seen as someone who needed to be pulled close. This is the quiet power of being underestimated. When you change, people don't panic, they rationalize. She's fine. She'll get back to us. That's just how she is. And for the first time, that assumption worked in my favor. I wasn't disappearing, I was repositioning. I started asking myself harder questions, not about him, but about me. What did I want from this relationship, realistically? What had I been giving without being asked? What would happen if I stopped compensating for the distance? These questions didn't come with anger, they came with clarity. I realized I had been participating in the illusion of closeness by always being available, by filling in gaps with understanding, by interpreting absence generously. Silence stripped that illusion away, and in its place, something steadier formed: self respect without announcement. I didn't confront my father because confrontation would have centered his response. Silence centered my awareness. He was free to notice or not, and I was free to stop waiting. By the end of that week, I understood something fundamental. When people mistake your silence for weakness, they reveal how little they've been listening all along. I still hadn't listened to the voicemail. At that point, it felt like a boundary. I didn't know yet how permanent it would become. What no one noticed was not my silence, but what I was doing with it. From the outside, I looked the same. Same routines, same calm demeanor, same steady reliability when I did engage. There were no dramatic shifts that would trigger concern, no declarations, no ultimatums. But internally, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. Silence gave me space, and in that space, patterns became unmistakable. I began documenting, not in a literal sense, not at first. I noticed timing: who reached out after a delay and who didn't, who followed up with curiosity and who moved on without pause, who asked questions that required listening and who spoke in monologues disguised as conversations. My father consistently fell into the second category. When he did call, the rhythm never changed. No acknowledgement of the missed connections, no adjustment, no checking whether I'd heard the previous message. Each interaction reset as if nothing had happened. It wasn't cruelty, it was a habit. And habits reveal priorities more honestly than words. I started to understand something uncomfortable. The closeness I thought we had relied almost entirely on my participation, on my availability, on my willingness to interpret minimal effort as sufficient. Without that, there was very little left. This realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I thought back over years of communication, how often I'd been the one to bridge gaps, soften tones, keep things moving, how rarely my absence had been named as a problem. I wasn't missed, I was expected. That distinction matters. In parallel, other areas of my life began to shift. I invested more in friendships, where reciprocity existed naturally, where silence prompted concern, not assumption, where questions were asked without being prompted. The contrast was stark. I began to see that my father wasn't uniquely distant. He was simply the person whose distance I had normalized the longest. And once I stopped doing that work for him, the relationship revealed its true shape. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't journal dramatically or rehearse speeches. I just observed and adjusted. I delayed responses intentionally, not to punish, but to measure. I stopped filling conversational gaps. I let awkward pauses exist. I didn't volunteer information unless it was requested. The result was subtle but telling. Conversations grew shorter, less frequent, more transactional, and still, no one noticed. Because from their perspective, nothing was wrong. I was still calm, still composed, still doing fine. This invisibility was something I had cultivated unknowingly for years. Now, I was using it consciously. I began preparing, not for confrontation, but for acceptance. Acceptance of what was real, not what I wished was true. I stopped imagining future conversations where things would finally be said. I stopped assuming there would be a moment when emotional clarity would arrive naturally. I understood that if I wanted something different, I would have to either ask for it explicitly or accept its absence. And asking felt wrong, not because I didn't deserve more, but because I knew the structure couldn't support it. Requesting emotional depth from someone who had never practiced it felt like asking them to speak a language they didn't know existed. So I positioned myself accordingly. I built a life that didn't hinge on his attention. I redistributed emotional weight. I made decisions without waiting for his input or approval. From the outside, this looked like maturity, growth, independence. From the inside, it was preparation. Preparation for a truth I hadn't fully named yet, but felt approaching. I still hadn't listened to the voicemail. By now, it felt less like avoidance and more like a sealed envelope, something that represented a version of the relationship I no longer lived inside. I didn't know what it contained, but I knew something else with certainty. Whatever it said, it would arrive too late to change the pattern that had already been exposed. And that knowledge changed how I held everything else. Quietly, completely. The reveal didn't come from my father. It came from me. One evening, weeks after that first unheard voicemail, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my phone face down beside my coffee. The apartment was quiet in that end of day way that feels both peaceful and slightly hollow. I wasn't waiting for anything. That's what made the moment possible. I picked up the phone without urgency and opened my call history. There it was. His name, multiple entries, missed calls, voicemails I hadn't touched. For the first time, I allowed myself to look at the pattern without softening it. Not emotionally, structurally. I counted the ratio. How many times he initiated contact versus how many times I did. How often were his messages informational instead of relational? How rarely he asked questions that couldn't be answered in a sentence. This wasn't about blame, it was about clarity. And the clarity was this: my presence had been the glue, not love, not intention, my availability. Once I stopped providing it automatically, the connection didn't adapt, it thinned. That was the leverage I hadn't known I had. Not power over him, but power over myself. I realized then that I had been living under an unspoken rule. If I stay easy, I'll stay connected. And I had followed that rule so faithfully that I never questioned whether the connection was actually mutual. This was the private reveal, the quiet truth that doesn't ask permission before settling in your body. I wasn't afraid of losing him anymore. I had already lost the version of him I needed, and I had done so slowly enough to mistake it for normal life. That understanding changed the weight of the unheard voicemail entirely. Before, it felt like an obligation waiting, something I owed attention to. Now, it felt symbolic, like an artifact from a relationship that only functioned under certain conditions. Conditions I was no longer willing to meet. I thought about listening to it. I really did. I imagined his voice, steady, familiar, distant in that particular way only parents can be, once you've outgrown the role they preferred you in. But I also knew this. Listening wouldn't give me new information. It would give me emotion without resolution. And I was tired of absorbing things that didn't move. So I didn't press play. That decision wasn't dramatic. It was precise. I set the phone down and felt something unexpected. Not relief, not sadness, but alignment. Like my actions finally matched what I knew to be true. This was the leverage I had discovered. I no longer needed to explain myself to participate less. Silence in this form wasn't withdrawal, it was consent revoked. I didn't tell anyone about this realization. Not friends, not family. This wasn't something that needed witnesses. Some truths only work when they remain private. From that point on, I made a quiet commitment to myself. I would stop compensating for emotional distance. I would stop translating minimal effort into care. I would stop assuming that time alone would fix what attention had never been given to. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't foresee consequences. I wasn't planning an outcome. I was simply done carrying a dynamic that relied on my silence to survive. The voicemail stayed unheard, not as punishment, as closure. At the time, I believed this was the end of it. A personal boundary drawn quietly, internally, without ripple effects. I didn't know yet that a moment was approaching when this choice would take on a weight I couldn't undo. Because clarity, once earned, doesn't always arrive before consequence. Sometimes it arrives just in time to show you what you can't go back and fix. The decision point didn't feel like a crossroads. There were no competing voices in my head, no internal debate weighing right against wrong. What I felt instead was a narrowing, like a path quietly closing behind me, while the one ahead remained unmarked. A few days after that evening at the kitchen table, my phone rang again. My father's name lit up the screen. I watched it until it stopped. Another voicemail. I didn't feel irritation. I didn't feel guilt. I felt something closer to neutrality, which scared me more than anger ever could have. This was the moment I could have corrected course. I could have called back. I could have listened. I could have re-entered the familiar pattern and restored the illusion of normalcy. And I knew, very clearly, that if I did, nothing would change. That clarity was the decision. It wasn't framed as I'm done. It was framed as I'm no longer participating in something that requires me to disappear to function. I thought about the future versions of myself that decision would create. One where I continued absorbing absence and calling it love. One where I named what I needed and risked hearing that it couldn't be met. One where I quietly accepted reality without demanding it reshape itself for my comfort. Only one of those felt honest. I chose honesty. That choice wasn't loud. It didn't involve confrontation or explanation. It involved restraint. I stopped checking the voicemails entirely. I archived the thread. I didn't delete anything yet. I wasn't ready for finality, but I removed it from my immediate field of attention. Out of sight, out of reflex. This wasn't cruelty. It was containment. I was containing the part of me that had learned to hope without evidence. I told myself something simple. If it's important, it will be made clear, not hinted at, not implied, not left hanging in the space I always filled. Days passed, then more. No escalation, no urgency, no one called to ask if I was okay. And that silence confirmed the decision more than any conversation could have. I realized that I had always believed there would be a moment when things would naturally deepen, when time would soften the distance, when we'd finally speak openly. But moments don't arrive on their own, they're created by intention. And intention had been absent for a long time. This was the irreversible part. Not the silence itself, but the internal shift. Once you stop waiting for someone to become different, you can't unlearn that truth. I wasn't punishing my father by stepping back. I was releasing myself from a role that required me to stay emotionally available without reciprocity. That release felt like grief and relief intertwined. I grieved the relationship I'd imagined, the conversations I'd rehearsed but never had, the closeness I'd assumed would come later. And I felt relief at no longer carrying that expectation. The decision point wasn't about him. It was about me choosing not to live in anticipation anymore. I didn't know yet that time was running out. I didn't sense urgency. I didn't feel warned. I simply believed there would always be another chance to listen. That assumption, that dangerous, quiet assumption, was the last thing I didn't question. When people imagine moving in silence, they usually picture strategy, plans laid carefully, outcomes anticipated, control maintained. What it actually looked like for me was much quieter than that. It looked like routine, like restraint, like choosing not to explain myself. I didn't announce the distance. I didn't justify it. I didn't warn anyone that something had changed. I simply stopped reaching. That choice reshaped my days in small, almost invisible ways. I no longer checked my phone reflexively when it buzzed. I didn't draft responses in my head while doing other things. I let messages sit without assigning them emotional weight. With my father, this meant something specific. I stopped translating ambiguity into care. If a message lacked curiosity, I didn't supply it for him. If a call carried no urgency, I didn't invent it. If silence followed, I let it stay silent. This wasn't about discipline, it was about alignment. My external behavior finally matched my internal reality. Life filled the space easily. Work demanded focus. Friends who knew how to ask real questions took up more room. I invested time in relationships where attention flowed both ways, without negotiation. And the absence of tension surprised me. I'd expected guilt to surface, doubt, second guessing. But instead, there was a steadiness I hadn't felt before, like standing on ground that didn't shift when I relaxed my weight. My father called less frequently after that. Or maybe it just felt that way because I wasn't tracking it anymore. There were a few more voicemails. Each one is similar in tone. Each one assumes continuity. He never acknowledged the growing gap. And that told me everything. Because when people feel distance that matters to them, they name it. They ask. They adjust. They don't proceed as if nothing has changed. I understood then that my silence wasn't being experienced as absence. It was being experienced as flexibility. That realization closed something in me. I archived the messages again. This time, I didn't hesitate. Moving in silence doesn't mean acting secretly. It means acting without the need for validation, without rehearsing how your choices will be received. I didn't feel empowered in a triumphant way. I felt settled. There was no plan for confrontation, no desire for explanation. If anything, I felt a growing certainty that explaining myself would only reopen a dynamic I had already outgrown. Some relationships don't end with conflict, they end with alignment. When you stop doing the work that kept them alive, I told myself honestly that if my father needed me, he would make that need unmistakable. He would ask directly. He would show up differently. I believed that. And because I believed it, I allowed myself to stop monitoring the situation. I lived as though time were abundant. I didn't know yet how fragile that assumption was. I didn't know that silence can protect you from pain, but it can also delay it until it arrives all at once. I moved forward calmly, unaware that the consequences of my quiet decision were already in motion, unseen, unannounced, irreversible. The consequences didn't arrive with a clear cause. There was no message that said something was wrong, no urgent call cutting through the quiet. Instead, they appeared as a subtle imbalance, like realizing the room has gone cold only after you've been sitting in it for a while. It started with other people, a casual comment from my aunt during a brief check in call. She mentioned my father in passing, something about him being a little quieter lately. The way she said it was almost dismissive, like an observation about the weather. Nothing alarming. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Later that week, my sister asked if I talked to him recently. Her tone was neutral, unbothered. I told her no. She shrugged it off verbally, filling the space with updates about her kids, her schedule, and her exhaustion. No one was worried. And that was the consequence I hadn't fully anticipated. When you've spent years being the stable one, your withdrawal doesn't register as a loss. It registers as an adjustment. People assume you're busy, or tired, or doing well enough not to need checking on. The absence of concern wasn't malicious. It was conditioned. I noticed my father's name stopped appearing on my screen altogether. Days passed, then more. I didn't track the time precisely. That would have meant re engaging emotionally. But I felt the stretch of it. Still, I told myself the same thing. If it matters, it will be named. But what happens when the people involved don't know how to name it? That question lingered longer than I expected. I began to sense a shift in family conversations. Nothing explicit, just a mild tension, like people were circling something without touching it. My father's presence was mentioned less. When it was, the tone was vague. He's been resting more. He's just tired. You know how he is. I didn't ask follow-up questions. Part of me believed that staying consistent with my boundary meant not re-entering the old role, the role of interpreter, the one who translated fragments into meaning. So I stayed quiet, and that quiet began to echo in ways I hadn't planned for. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when doubt flickered. I remember standing in line at the grocery store, phone in my hand, thinking briefly about checking my archived messages. The thought passed. I told myself that if something had changed, someone would tell me that this wasn't my responsibility anymore. That belief felt reasonable. It had logic behind it. But logic doesn't always account for human avoidance. People don't like delivering uncomfortable information. They delay it. They soften it. They wait for the right moment, which rarely arrives. And I had made it very easy for myself to wait on. The consequence wasn't punishment. It was a disconnection, unfolding quietly across multiple people, each assuming someone else would step in if needed. I wasn't being excluded. I was being spared. Spared the worry, spared the discomfort, spared the responsibility of reacting. And because I didn't ask, because I didn't push, because I didn't break my silence, the information moved around me instead of toward me. This was the cost of invisibility I hadn't calculated. By the time I sensed that something was off, the distance was already doing its work. Not dramatically, not cruelly, just effectively. I still believed there would be time. That assumption was the last thing holding everything together. And it was already beginning to fail. The call came on an ordinary morning. That detail has never left me. The way the day didn't announce itself as different. No sense of impending collapse. Just light through the curtains and the low hum of traffic outside. It was my sister. Her voice was steady, practiced in the way people sound when they've already said the words once and are bracing to say them again. Dad's in the hospital, she said. There was a pause. Not for drama, for adjustment. He passed last night. The sentence landed without sound. No sharp intake of breath, no immediate reaction. My body went very still, as if freezing would buy me time to understand what I just heard. I remember asking practical questions. When? Where? What happened? My voice sounded normal to my own ears. Calm. Capable. I didn't cry. After the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. I wasn't replaying memories or rushing toward regret. I was thinking about the voicemail. I picked up my phone. The notifications were still there, buried exactly where I'd left them. Missed calls, voicemails, untouched. That was when the weight arrived. Not as emotion, but as certainty. There would be no more messages, no clarification, no follow up, no chance to hear his voice again outside of what was already recorded. The realization didn't explode. It settled. I listened to the voicemail then. I won't repeat what he said. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't, but because it doesn't matter in the way people expect it to. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a confession. It was him, familiar, ordinary, contained. He hadn't known. He hadn't known it would be the last time he spoke to me. And neither had I. That's what made it unbearable. I deleted the voicemail afterward. Not in anger, not in denial, but because keeping it felt like preserving something incomplete. A fragment without context. A soundbite that couldn't resolve what it represented. I didn't want to replay his voice out of sequence with reality. This was the point of no return. Everything I had believed about time, about having space to come back to things later, collapsed into that one irreversible fact. Later had ended. People tell you there's no right way to grieve. What they don't tell you is that some grief doesn't look like mourning. It looks like recalibration, like reviewing years of interaction through a lens you never wanted to use. I wasn't drowning in regret. I was standing in it. I understood with brutal clarity that my silence had been reasonable, my boundaries had been valid, and still, this was the outcome. Both things were true. That's the part no one prepares you for. You can act with integrity and still arrive at a loss without resolution. I didn't wish I had performed more. I didn't wish I had gone back to the old role. I wished I had asked one direct question sooner, not out of obligation, out of honesty. But wishing doesn't reverse time. It only sharpens your understanding of how fragile assumptions really are. I had assumed there would always be time, and I was wrong. There was no confrontation with my father, not in the way people usually mean it. No final conversation where everything was said. No moment of emotional truth exchanged across a hospital bed. The confrontation came later, and it wasn't loud. It happened in the quiet days after the funeral, in conversations that never raised their voices but carried a new weight underneath every word. Family members spoke carefully around me, as if I were fragile. They asked if I was okay in ways that didn't expect an honest answer. I said I was managing, and I was. What they didn't ask, what no one asked, was whether I had known how sick he was. Because the truth was uncomfortable. I hadn't. At some point, my sister mentioned, almost casually, that Dad had been trying to get things in order, making calls, leaving messages, reaching out in his way. She looked at me then, just for a second. Did he ever get through to you? She asked. I didn't hesitate. He called, I said. I didn't listen right away. That was it. No accusation, no explanation, just a fact. The room went quiet, not tense, but recalibrating. I could feel everyone adjusting their internal narratives, trying to fit this information somewhere that wouldn't require too much discomfort. No one blamed me. That surprised me. Instead, there was a collective pause, a recognition that something had been missed, but no clear place to assign responsibility. My silence, his distance, everyone's assumptions. It all existed in the same space, unresolved. Later, alone, my sister asked gently why I hadn't called back sooner. Her tone wasn't judgmental. It was confused. I told her the truth. Not the long version, not the philosophical one, just the simple explanation. I didn't know there was urgency, I said. There never had been before. She nodded slowly. She understood more than she said. That was the confrontation. Not anger, not blame, but reality. Stated plainly. I didn't defend myself. I didn't apologize for protecting myself either. There was nothing to argue about. The facts were enough. My father had reached out in the only way he knew how. I had responded based on the pattern I'd been given. The timing didn't forgive either of us. That's what made it quiet. There was no moral high ground to claim, no villain to point to, just a shared recognition of how easily people miss each other when communication relies on habit instead of intention. In the past, I would have filled that silence. I would have explained more, softened the edges, taken on the emotional weight of everyone else's discomfort. I didn't this time. I let the truth stand on its own. That restraint felt like growth, not coldness. Because this wasn't about winning understanding. It was about no longer contorting myself to make things easier to digest. There are losses that don't end relationships, they clarify them. And this one clarified mine. I could hold grief without self betrayal. I could acknowledge regret without rewriting my history as a mistake. I could accept responsibility without taking on blame that wasn't mine alone. That balance was new, and it was quiet. After everything settled, after the calls stopped, after the logistics were handled, after people returned to their routines, I expected something in me to break open, some delayed collapse, some emotional reckoning I'd been postponing. It didn't happen. What came instead was a slower, more permanent shift in how I understood myself. For a long time, I believed my value in relationships came from how easy I was to have around, how little space I took up, how smoothly I adapted. Strength, I thought, meant not needing much. Now I know better. Strength isn't silence by default, it's a choice. And I hadn't been choosing for a long time. I had been complying. Losing my father didn't make me regret setting boundaries. It made me regret not naming them earlier. There's an important difference. I don't wish I had been louder. I don't wish I had demanded something he didn't know how to give. But I do wish I had trusted myself enough to speak plainly when things first felt off. Not to change him, to change me. I live differently now. Not dramatically, intentionally. I don't assume people know what I need just because I've been capable before. I don't let my silence be misread as endless availability. When something matters, I name it early, even if my voice shakes a little. I've learned that being low maintenance often just means your needs are going unmet quietly. And I no longer participate in that bargain. With others, this has changed the shape of my relationships. Some grew stronger, some drifted away. That didn't feel like loss. It felt like sorting. With myself, it brought a kind of steadiness I didn't know was possible. I trust my internal signals now. When something feels misaligned, I don't explain it away. I listen. My father still exists in my life, just not as a conversation waiting to be finished. He exists as a reminder of what happens when time is treated like a guarantee instead of a resource. I don't replay his voicemail. I don't need to. The lesson isn't in the words, it's in the space around them. If I sound calm now, it's not because I feel nothing, it's because I've learned how to hold complexity without turning it into drama. Grief doesn't always ask to be witnessed loudly. Sometimes it just asks to be integrated. I didn't become harder after this. I became clearer. And clarity, I've learned, is its own form of kindness. There are stories that end with forgiveness, and stories that end with confrontation. This one ends with understanding, and that's quieter than most people expect. For a long time, I tried to decide whether deleting my father's voicemail was a mistake or a mercy. I don't frame it that way anymore. It wasn't an act of defiance, and it wasn't an act of denial. It was the final expression of a pattern that had already run its course. The truth is, the voicemail didn't fail because I didn't listen soon enough. It failed because it carried everything that had gone unsaid for years, compressed into a moment that assumed time would cooperate. And time doesn't do that. What this experience taught me isn't that we should always rush to respond or live in constant emotional urgency. It taught me something more uncomfortable. Silence teaches people how to treat us. When we stay quiet to keep peace, others learn that peace doesn't require our presence, only our compliance. When we delay saying what matters, we train ourselves to believe there will always be a later moment that feels safer. There often isn't. But here's the part that matters most to me. You can act reasonably. You can protect yourself. You can move with integrity and still lose something you didn't know you were saying goodbye to. That doesn't mean you were wrong. It means life doesn't wait for emotional readiness. If there's a moral here, it's not always listen to the voicemail. It doesn't build relationships that only survive on your silence. Say the thing earlier. Ask the direct question. Name the distance when it first appears, not to accuse, but to orient yourself in reality. And if you're someone who has always been the strong one, the reliable one, the person everyone assumes will be fine, remember this. Being fine is not the same as being seen. I don't tell the story to assign blame. I tell it because it changed how I live, and because I know I'm not the only one who assumed there would always be time. If you're comfortable sharing, I'd like to ask you something, and I'd really read your answers. Have you ever postponed listening, responding, or speaking honestly with someone because you believed there would be another chance later, and then realized later had already passed. Thank you for listening.